Okay, so one of the reasons why I wanted to get that ignition wire, rear ignition wires out of the way is I wanted to expose this connector right here, which connects to the fuel injection wiring harness. That's going to have to be disconnected to get it up and out of the way, and the other end of the wiring harness over here has to be disconnected. You can see I've already done that. So once I disconnect those two items, then the wiring harness can be just lifted up and out of the engine compartment. And you can see here it also had this little connection that went to the throttle body. Okay, when working on a fuel injector rail, there's one very important thing to remember. Two. First is that it's under very high pressure, and so there is a pressure release nozzle that's right here. Hopefully you'll be able to see that guy right here, and you just unscrew that, and inside is a little push release mechanism that I just actuated, and it's kind of like a bike tire air valve, and you just push down on that, and that releases a lot of the pressure, and you don't want that fuel coming out at 50 psi. The other really important thing is you want to have all your electricity disconnected when you start messing around with the fuel rail. You can also see that I've disconnected the connectors to the fuel injectors. I've disconnected the harness at this end, which there was a additional connector down here that went to a temperature sensor on the intake manifold, in addition to this wiring connector. I already showed you this other connector over here that came out. And so now we're ready to take out the fuel rail. That comes out via just 4 bolts, 1, 2, 3, and number 4 over here. Once those are done, this fuel rail is just going to lift right out, and it basically just inserts into the top of the injectors, and the injectors insert into the top of the intake manifold via just a press fit, nothing more than a press fit. So you just have to kind of wiggle the injectors backwards, and the injectors are going to come out attached to the fuel rail, and they're going to disconnect at the intake manifold sort of way down here, and you just got to kind of wiggle them back and forth until they release and come out, and that's all there is to it. The other thing is that I talked about that quick release mechanism. That's way down here, and you put that little collar tool on here, down here, and you press upward after the collar is on there to do the quick disconnect on the high pressure fuel line. And that's a very nice device that's reusable, that enables you to connect the fuel line and disconnect the fuel line kind of at will. But you've got to relieve that pressure using this valve right here before you attempt that. Okay, it's now time to disconnect that quick connector, which you can see right down there. And the way that's going to happen is we're going to wrap this quick connector release device around the lower fuel pipe in just this orientation, and then just press up on the fitting, and it's going to cause it to release. So I'll connect that up and then show you how it's going to work. So there you can see the quick connect device, which is just a little collar, a plastic collar with a sharp end closest to the pipe, and I'm going to press up on that to disconnect the quick connect fitting. So I'll back away here. See if we can see a little bit what's going on. Not sure that we can, but I'm going to give this a shot. Okay, there we've got the fuel line. It's come out, and there's plenty of fuel in there, especially because it's under high pressure. And so I'm going to put some towels underneath it to soak up that fuel. Okay, now I'm ready to take out the fuel rail. And so you basically take out 3 cylinders at a time. And I've disconnected these 4 bolts that attach the fuel rail to the top of the intake manifold. And so I'm just going to grab the metal fuel rail, put my thumbs under it, and just pull upward, and those fuel injectors came out, and the front fuel injectors came out. And so then I can just lift up the entire fuel rail assembly. Fuel injectors are also attached, and so is the wiring harness. So all that comes out as one unit, and this is the fuel injector that I suspect is bad, although it could be a wiring harness problem. Anyway, we're going to take this, put it on a workbench, and get that fuel injector out. Okay, here is the fuel injection rail and the wiring harness on a bench or on a table. And I'm going to show you over here the quick disconnect device. So this is what connected to the fuel line to the tank, and it's just basically a press-on fit, and it just used that little collar device to go up into this orifice and caused it to disconnect. So it's a very neat little arrangement. And so the fuel goes in through here and in through the fuel rail, distributes to the injectors, around to the back rail, and to each of those injectors. So looking at the number 1 fuel injector, that's the one that we have to take off because it's gone bad. And one of the things I did was I took the new injector that I had bought from CarQuest and I compared it, and they don't exactly match. They're not the same. The machining on them appears to be slightly different, but they seem to match up where the shoulders are, where the end of the injector is, where the O-ring is located in relation to the rest of the shaft, where the bottom of the injector lines up. So I'm going to pull out the old one and see how the whole thing lines up, see if I'm comfortable with putting in this new one that I bought from CarQuest, which doesn't exactly match the factory ones, but it should have all the same operating parameters as far as pulse width and orifice size on the end. Also, the orifices were different. You can see that this orifice on the old one is recessed, and the new one does not have a recessed orifice, and so I don't know what the operational effect of that is going to be. So on the fuel injector rail, the fuel injectors are connected to the rail via these little clips, and so I just took a screwdriver and pried the clip backwards. There's a couple of little recessed slots that the clip secures into, and so I just pried it off of there. Pardon me, over here. I just pulled this clip, pried it backwards so it rotated back like that. And when it goes back on, it'll be a little bit different. I think it's just the fuel injector is just going to press down into it. So we take off the clip, and then we just kind of rotate the injector a little bit, and it comes right out. It's a press fit once you get that clip off, just like it was a press fit on the other end into the intake manifold. Kind of counterintuitive that there wouldn't be something more substantial screwing it in or securing it in, but it just slips right in. Taking it out would have been a lot more difficult if I hadn't have taken this out a couple of weeks ago when I did a head job on this car, replaced the heads, because I re-lubricated all of these O-rings and actually replaced the O-rings, but I lubricated them with motor oil, which is what they recommend, before I inserted them in, so that they'd be lubricated and easy to slide in and out. It helps with the installation process immensely. It was a bit more difficult to take this fuel injector rail out the first time after it had been in there for 18 years. The O-rings were dried and things were a little bit more seized up, so it took a little bit more working it back and forth to get it out. Okay, this is a shot of the fuel rail with the new fuel injector installed right here at the #1 position. I've put it back in. I've hooked up the wire connectors to the 6 fuel injectors again. And I just wanted to show you something about what I was talking about, the high pressure fuel line, the quick disconnect fitting right here. And this is the high pressure fuel line section that was compromised when I had this out the last time. It was very old, it was brittle, it was cracking, it was ready to start leaking, and so I replaced it with a new section of fuel injection fuel line. Now that is a very specific application. You can't just put regular fuel line for a carburetor in there. It won't withstand the high pressure of fuel injection, of a fuel injection fuel pump, which pumps it up to about 50 to 60 pounds per square inch instead of the 5 or 6 pounds per square inch that a regular carburetor fuel line will have to sustain. So this is much tougher fuel line. You need to get that, and you need to have these high pressure fuel line clamps that are special clamps. Now the old line was sort of crimped with a permanent crimp fitting at each end. I had to cut those off. I used a Dremel tool with a steel rotary wheel cutter, and I just cut it lengthwise along the crimp casing. I cut it on 2 sides so that the thing just opened up like an avocado, and got the old casing off there. Then you slit the old line with a razor blade or some sort of a cutter, get it off of there, and then measure a new section of line, which I believe this was 12.5 inches, to match the old line perfectly, and put it on there with the high pressure clamps. We're now going to torque down the 4 fuel rail attachment bolts, and those are 13 millimeter bolts, and they have to be torqued to 200 inch-pounds. I'm just double checking each of these bolts, make sure that the torque wrench is clicking, indicating that it's torqued to 200 inch-pounds, which I've set on the dial here. Double check the wire connectors to make sure that they are down on each of the injectors. That all looks good. Now I can start hooking back up the electrical harness connectors. This is the big one on this end. Hook that in there. After we put it together, we'll press down on the locking device. Over here, the other connector. And the temperature sender connector. Put that back on. And then the quick disconnect fitting. It just presses back on. And I heard it click, which signifies that it's made a positive connection. So now we're ready to put the intake plenum back on. One of the things I wanted to show you before I put the plenum back in is that EGR tube which connects to the underside of the plenum. This is the tube with the little connection device, and it screws into the bottom of the plenum with two 13mm bolts. So without getting those bolts out and disconnecting it, the plenum won't come out. You can see this tube connects down to the rear of the exhaust, the rear bank exhaust manifold. Okay, getting this intake plenum back on the car is going to be a step-by-step process, in part because of that cable in the back that has to be connected up to the plenum before you put it in its final position and lose all your work room back there. And that cable is going to be secured with these little 10mm bolts that screw into the back of the plenum. One of the things you want to be alert to is there is this PVC tube that comes over the top of the rear valve cover and connects into the plenum here. This very easily could drop back behind the valve cover while you're putting the plenum back on, and you don't want it to be back behind the valve cover. It's supposed to be in the intake valley tray, or the valley here, basically along the inside of the rear valve cover, and then the PVC hooks to the intake plenum near where the throttle body inlet is. So that's something that you want to be sensitive to. Okay, one of the things I realized as I was putting this plenum back into position was that since the spark plug wires disappear behind the plenum and underneath it, I really need to have them labeled to know where they go back into position on the coil. Even though the coil has numbers on it for the respective spark plug wires, the spark plug wires all look the same, and they disappear behind the engine there, and so it's hard to see which one's number 1, which one's number 3, which one's number 5. So I went back and labeled them 1, 3, and 5 before I seat that plenum back down onto its bolt holes. Okay folks, we're now underneath the car, and if you're asking why we're underneath the car when we're working on fuel injection, the EGR tube, which I told you comes off the rear of the exhaust manifold and connects to the bottom of the intake plenum, that EGR tube didn't want to hook back up. And the reason is it's a rigid line, and so if the bolt holes don't exactly line up, the bolts don't want to go back in because everything's too inflexible, and so I've got to loosen the lower 2 bolts where it connects to the exhaust manifold so I get some movement in the whole apparatus, get all 4 bolts started back in, and then tighten them up. But right now, with the bottom 2 bolts being cinched up, it's just too rigid for me to get the top bolts back started into the plenum. And so here is a shot of basically the catalytic converter and the rear of the exhaust manifold, and right there you could see that rigid EGR line hooking into the side of the exhaust manifold with 2 bolts connecting it. So I just got to loosen those 2 bolts, get some movement in the whole line, then go back up top and get the bolts started on the underside of the plenum.